The airport was busy, like it always was. People hurried through the wide halls, pulling their rolling bags behind them. Announcements echoed from the speakers, calling out boarding times and flight numbers. Children laughed, babies cried, and the smell of coffee drifted from a small cafe near the gate. Among the crowd was a family who looked like any other, quiet, calm, and ready to board their flight. The father, Mr. Thompson, carried himself with quiet confidence. He was dressed simply in a plain shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers. To strangers, he looked like an ordinary man traveling with his family. But what no one knew was that he was one of the most powerful CEOs in the airline industry. A man who had built his success from hard work and sharp vision. With him was his wife, elegant yet modest in her style, and their 2 children, both excited about the journey ahead. The family walked toward the gate together, chatting softly. The children pointed out planes through the big windows, marveling at the sight of the massive machines resting on the tarmac. "Look, Daddy, that one looks like ours," the younger child said with excitement. Mr. Thompson smiled warmly. He enjoyed moments like this where he could just be a father, not a businessman, not a CEO, not someone constantly surrounded by meetings and responsibilities. At the gate, the attendants scanned their tickets without hesitation. "First class, right this way," she said politely, giving them a professional smile. The family thanked her and began walking down the jet bridge toward the aircraft. The children laughed and ran a few steps ahead, their small backpacks bouncing against their shoulders. Inside the plane, the cabin lights glowed softly. The first-class section was wide and welcoming, with large, comfortable seats and neatly folded blankets. Passengers were settling in, some reading newspapers, others adjusting their seats. The Thompson family moved quietly to their assigned places. Mr. Thompson helped his wife stow a bag in the overhead bin while his children slid into their seats, already exploring the buttons that made the chairs recline. To them, it was just another trip. They had traveled many times before, sometimes on private jets, sometimes on commercial flights. This time, they had chosen to fly like any ordinary family, enjoying the simplicity of blending into the crowd. Mr. Thompson liked that. He believed it kept his children humble, reminding them that not every journey needed to be about luxury and special treatment. As they settled in, a few passengers nearby gave them polite nods. Some didn't notice them at all. After all, in airports, people often focus only on themselves, their flights, and their destinations. To most, they were just another family heading somewhere important. The children were cheerful, their voices soft but full of excitement. "Can we watch a movie on the screen?" the older one asked, pressing the touchscreen in front of her. Mr. Thompson chuckled. "Yes, but first let's wait for everyone to get on board." He leaned back, stretching his legs, feeling a rare sense of peace. Traveling with family always reminded him why he worked so hard. The flight attendants moved up and down the aisle, greeting passengers with polite smiles. Some offered drinks, others helped with luggage. Everything seemed normal. For the Thompson family, it was just the beginning of another smooth trip. But beneath the surface of that calm moment, something else was brewing. Not everyone saw them as ordinary passengers. A certain flight attendant's eyes lingered on the family longer than on others. She noticed their skin color, their casual clothes, and the way they carried themselves with quiet confidence. Her mind, clouded with assumptions, began to form its own unfair story about who they were, who she thought they weren't. The Thompson family, unaware of the judgment forming just a few rows away, continued to relax. The mother leaned over to help the younger child adjust his seatbelt, whispering softly so he wouldn't feel nervous. Mr. Thompson glanced out the window, watching the airport staff prepare the plane for departure. He felt content. He was just another father traveling with his family, and he liked it that way. The boarding process continued. More passengers entered. The overhead bins filled, and the cabin grew busier. The intercom crackled as the captain welcomed everyone aboard. The Thompson children clapped happily, ready for takeoff to the family. The day seemed ordinary, an ordinary boarding, an ordinary flight, an ordinary journey. But what they didn't know was that this ordinary moment would soon turn extraordinary. A single choice made by a flight attendant, driven by prejudice and quick judgment, would change everything for now. Though the Thompsons smiled, buckled their seatbelts, and prepared for what they thought would be a simple, peaceful trip through the skies. The cabin was almost full now. Passengers shuffled to their seats, tucking bags under chairs, pressing buttons to test how far the seats reclined, and fastening their belts as the announcements played softly overhead. Everything seemed ordinary, at least to most. But not everyone looked at the Thompsons with ordinary eyes. Near the front, a flight attendant moved briskly down the aisle. Her uniform was neat, her smile polite, but her eyes told another story. She scanned the passengers carefully, as if evaluating who fit in and who didn't. When her gaze landed on the Thompson family, her expression shifted, subtle but sharp. It was the kind of look that judged before asking, assumed before knowing. The family, busy settling in, didn't notice at first. The children were excited, pointing at the little screens on the seats in front of them. Mrs. Thompson leaned over to remind them to keep their voices down. Mr. Thompson adjusted his watch and glanced at the flight menu tucked in the seat pocket. They looked comfortable, calm, and very much at ease in their first-class seats. But to the attendant, that was the problem. She tilted her head slightly, frowning. Their casual clothes didn't match the polished suits she was used to seeing in first class. The way the children giggled freely seemed, in her eyes, out of place, and the fact that they took their seats with quiet confidence only fueled her assumptions. She whispered to another crew member as she passed, her lips tight. "Check row 3. Something doesn't look right." The other attendant glanced over briefly, then shrugged, too busy helping an elderly passenger with a heavy bag. But the first attendant couldn't let it go. She kept looking back, her eyes narrowing each time. To her, the Thompsons didn't belong where they were sitting. Mr. Thompson finally noticed her lingering stares. He met her eyes briefly and gave a polite nod, the same kind he gave to people in meetings when he wanted to acknowledge them without words. But instead of returning the courtesy, the attendant looked away quickly, her lips pressed thin. Mrs. Thompson noticed too. She leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She keeps looking at us." Double quotes. Mr. Thompson sighed quietly, used to such moments. It wasn't the first time he and his family had been judged by strangers who thought they didn't belong in certain places. He patted his wife's hand gently. "Ignore it," he murmured. "We know who we are." But David, the older child, caught the exchange. He looked up at the attendant, confusion filling his young eyes. "Dad, why is she staring at us like that?" he asked innocently. Mr. Thompson forced a smile for his son. "Sometimes people look without thinking. Don't worry about it." He didn't want his children to feel the weight of prejudice so young. But it was hard to shield them from everything. The attendant, meanwhile, scribbled something quickly on her notepad as if making a record. She walked past again, this time stopping near their row. Her tone was professional, but edged with suspicion. "Excuse me, may I see your boarding passes again?" Mr. Thompson raised his brows, but remained calm. Of course, he reached into his pocket and handed over the tickets. The slips clearly showed first class row 3. She glanced at them quickly, her eyes narrowing as if she still didn't believe what she saw. She muttered, handing them back with a tight smile that wasn't really a smile at all. "Thank you," double quotes. Mrs. Thompson felt her chest tighten with irritation, but she stayed composed. She knew her husband preferred calmness over confrontation. Still, the tension was hard to ignore. Other passengers nearby had noticed too. A businessman a few rows back frowned slightly, wondering why the family was being singled out. A woman traveling alone shifted in her seat, her eyes darting between the family and the attendant. Whispers began to stir, subtle but present. The Thompsons tried to focus on their own world. The children began watching a cartoon on the small screens. Giggling again, Mrs. Thompson opened a magazine. Though she barely turned the pages, Mr. Thompson leaned back, his jaw tight. Pretending to be relaxed while inside, he felt the familiar sting of being judged unfairly. The attendant, however, wasn't done. To her, the boarding passes weren't enough. She carried with her the weight of assumptions, and once those settled in her mind, no paper could erase them. As she moved back toward the front of the cabin, she whispered to herself, "They don't belong here. I'll sort it out." And in that glance, that one long, judging stare, the fate of the flight shifted. What should have been a peaceful journey for a family became the beginning of an ordeal none of them expected. The ordinary act of boarding a plane was about to turn into a public confrontation that would reveal not just bias, but also a shocking truth waiting to explode. For now, though, the Thompson family sat quietly in their seats, unaware of how quickly judgment would rise into something bigger, something that would shake the cabin, silence the passengers, and leave the flight attendant face to face with a truth she could never have imagined. The cabin was calm. But beneath the surface, something was building. The Thompsons were quietly enjoying the start of their flight. The children were settling into their seats, their laughter soft and innocent. Mrs. Thompson leaned toward her daughter, adjusting the little blanket on her lap, while Mr. Thompson scrolled through the in-flight entertainment menu. To them, this was a normal family moment, but to the flight attendant, it was not. She had convinced herself that something wasn't right. No matter what the boarding passes showed, no matter how calm and polite the family appeared, her mind clung stubbornly to her judgment. They don't belong here. She walked down the aisle again, her steps sharp and her face stern. Other passengers glanced up, sensing something unusual in her manner. She stopped right in front of the Thompsons, her shadow falling over them. "Excuse me," she said, her tone clipped. "I need to ask you again, are you sure you're in the correct seats?" Mr. Thompson looked up slowly, his expression calm, but his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yes," he replied, his voice steady. "These are our assigned seats. You already checked our passes." The attendant's lips tightened. "I'd like to see them again," she demanded. Mrs. Thompson shifted uncomfortably, her heart sinking. She knew what this was really about, though the attendant would never admit it. Still, she reached into her purse and handed the boarding passes to her husband, who calmly passed them to the woman. The attendant scanned them as though expecting to find a mistake hidden between the printed lines. "First class, row 3, C, A, B, C, and D." Everything was correct. Yet her face didn't soften. Instead, she handed them back abruptly, her suspicion still heavy. "I see," she said flatly. "But I'll need to verify this with the captain." Mrs. Thompson's patience cracked. She leaned forward slightly, her voice firm but calm. "We've already shown you the tickets twice. Why are you questioning us? Everyone else boarded without this kind of treatment." The attendant stiffened, her face flushing. "Ma'am, I'm simply doing my job. It's a matter of protocol." Mr. Thompson raised a hand gently, calming his wife before she said more. His voice remained level, but there was an unmistakable edge now. "No, this isn't protocol. Protocol is treating every passenger equally. Right now, you're singling us out." Nearby passengers had begun to notice the tension. A man in a suit leaned forward, his brow furrowed. A young woman across the aisle pulled out her phone quietly, pressing record. The soft clicks of cameras and whispers filled the air. The children looked at their parents, confusion in their eyes. "Daddy, did we do something wrong?" the little boy asked softly. Mr. Thompson shook his head quickly, his voice soothing. "No, son. We did nothing wrong. He gave his daughter's hand a squeeze, his calmness masking the storm rising inside him. The flight attendant crossed her arms. Sir, if you continue to make this difficult, I may have to ask you and your family to leave the aircraft until this can be sorted properly. Gasps spread through the nearby rows. Passengers exchanged shocked looks. A few muttered under their breath, "That's not right, and why them?" The weight of the injustice was clear to everyone watching. Mrs. Thompson felt her heart pound, anger rising in her chest. She opened her mouth to speak, but her husband placed a steady hand on her arm. He had dealt with prejudice before in boardrooms, in meetings, in places where people underestimated him because of how he looked. He knew when to fight with words and when to fight with silence. This time, he chose silence. He leaned back in his seat, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed on the attendant. That calm stare unsettled her more than any outburst would have. She cleared her throat, flustered, and turned away quickly, walking back up the aisle with quick, clipped steps. But the damage had been done. The confrontation wasn't just between her and the Thompsons anymore. It was now a performance the entire cabin had witnessed. David, the older child, whispered to his mother, "Why does she think we don't belong here?" His innocent question stung deeper than any insult. Mrs. Thompson hugged him gently, whispering back, "Because some people judge without knowing." But the truth always comes out, and indeed, the truth was closer than anyone realized. The confrontation had lit the spark. The next step, the ejection, was about to shock the entire cabin. But soon after, the revelation would shake the flight attendant's world to its core. For now, the Thompsons sat quietly, their dignity intact, their strength silent but visible. The confrontation was over, but the battle was only beginning. The air in the cabin felt heavier now. The whispers of passengers spread like ripples across water, soft but unmistakable. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others exchanged quiet glances filled with disapproval. The flight, which had begun with the ordinary routine of boarding and finding seats, was suddenly charged with tension. The Thompsons remained seated, calm but uneasy. Mrs. Thompson kept her arm around the children, trying to shield them from the growing unease. Mr. Thompson, his face unreadable, stared out the window for a moment, collecting himself. He knew where this was heading. He had seen this kind of storm before. The flight attendant returned, her footsteps sharp against the carpeted aisle. This time, her voice carried more authority, as though she had convinced herself she was right, no matter what the facts said. "Sir," she said firmly, "I've spoken to the captain. Until we can verify your booking further, I need you and your family to leave the plane." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Gasps came from several rows. A woman across the aisle whispered, "But they showed their tickets." Another man shook his head, muttering, "This is wrong." Mr. Thompson turned to face the attendant fully. His voice was calm, steady, but carried a weight that made nearby passengers lean in. "We've already shown our tickets. Twice, we are in the correct seats. Forcing us off this plane is not protocol, it's discrimination." The attendant's cheeks flushed. "Sir, please don't make this more difficult. If you refuse, I will have no choice but to call security." The younger Thompson child clutched his mother's arm, eyes wide with fear. "Mom, are we in trouble?" he whispered. Mrs. Thompson stroked his hair gently, her heart breaking at the innocence in his voice. "No, sweetheart. We've done nothing wrong." The cabin grew louder now, voices rising. A man in the back raised his voice. "Let them stay. This is ridiculous." A young woman with her phone still recording whispered, "The world needs to see this." But the flight attendant stood her ground. "Sir," she repeated, her voice sharp and final, "you and your family need to disembark immediately." Mr. Thompson sighed softly. His patience was strong, But his children's frightened faces were what decided his next move. He wasn't about to let them experience a dragged-out scene that would scar their memory of this trip. With quiet dignity, he unbuckled his seatbelt. "Come on, kids," he said gently, standing and reaching for the overhead bin. His voice was calm, but his movements carried the heaviness of a man who had been here before, who had endured such moments many times in silence. Mrs. Thompson stood as well, her eyes glistening but her chin held high. She gathered the children, helping them collect their small bags. The cabin fell into hushed silence. Passengers watched with wide eyes as the family of four slowly made their way down the aisle, carrying not just their belongings, but the weight of humiliation. The children kept close to their parents, their little faces a mixture of confusion and sadness. The whispers turned to murmurs now. "This is wrong," someone said firmly. Another muttered, "I can't believe this is happening in front of us." The sound of a phone camera clicked again. Evidence of the injustice was being captured, moment by moment. As the family neared the front of the plane, Mrs. Thompson glanced back briefly. Her eyes met those of a few kind passengers who offered sympathetic nods. That small show of support gave her strength. But the pain of the humiliation still burned. The flight attendant, standing near the door now, gestured stiffly toward the exit. Her expression was tight, her confidence faltering slightly under the weight of so many eyes. But still, she pressed on, clinging to her false certainty. Mr. Thompson paused at the door. He turned back for one last look at the cabin. His gaze wasn't angry, it was calm, almost unreadable, but it carried something powerful. It was the look of a man who knew the truth always found its way to the surface. Then, without a word, he guided his family down the jet bridge. The cabin doors closed behind them with a soft thud. But the echo of what had just happened lingered. Passengers sat in stunned silence, knowing they had just witnessed something bigger than a misunderstanding. This wasn't about tickets or protocol. It was about judgment. What no one realized, least of all the flight attendant, was that this moment, her decision would soon flip the world she thought she controlled. Because the man she had just forced off the plane wasn't just any passenger. He was the CEO, the very owner of the airline she worked for. And the truth was about to land harder than any plane ever could. The air outside the cabin felt colder as the Thompson family stepped through the jet bridge. For the children, it was confusing. They had been excited to fly, but now they were being led away as though they had done something wrong. For the parents, it was not confusion, it was humiliation. Mr. Thompson walked tall, his shoulders straight, but inside, he felt the sting. He had built a life of respect, dignity, and unimaginable success, yet here he was, being treated as if he didn't belong. His wife held the children close, her heart breaking at the way her daughter's eyes brimmed with tears. "Daddy, why can't we stay on the plane?" the little boy asked, his voice small and trembling. Mr. Thompson bent slightly, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Because sometimes people don't see the truth, son. But that doesn't change who we are." His words were calm, but they carried a storm of emotion beneath them. Behind them, the cabin was still buzzing. Passengers had seen everything. Some were outraged, others whispered in disbelief. A few had captured the entire ordeal on their phones. "This is going to go viral," one man muttered as he pressed stop on his recording. "People need to see this." Back inside the plane, the flight attendant tried to resume her duties, but the eyes of the passengers burned holes into her composure. She straightened her uniform, forcing a professional smile, but her hands trembled slightly. She had no idea what storm was waiting for her beyond the safety of that cabin in the terminal. Ground staff approached the Thompsons, looking awkward and uncertain. They had been told to escort the family away, but even they could sense something was wrong. The tickets in Mr. Thompson's hand clearly said first class. Everything about the family screamed respectability. Yet they had been thrown off as though they were trespassers. "Sir, if you'll follow me," one staff member said softly, unable to meet Mr. Thompson's eyes. Mrs. Thompson lifted her chin. "My children have been embarrassed. Do you realize what you've just done to them?" The staff member shifted uncomfortably. "Ma'am, I'm just following instructions. I'm truly sorry." The family was led to the waiting area near the gate. Other passengers in the terminal, curious about the commotion, turned to look. Some recognized Mr. Thompson instantly. Whispers started to spread, quiet at first, then louder. "Isn't that?" One man whispered to his wife. She nodded quickly, her eyes wide. David, the older child, tugged at his father's sleeve. "Dad, why are they all staring?" Mr. Thompson exhaled slowly. "Because sometimes the truth can't stay hidden forever." The humiliation of being ejected was clear. But beneath it all, there was something else building. The quiet dignity in the CEO's eyes wasn't anger, it was control. He had learned long ago that power wasn't in shouting or forcing. It was in patience, in knowing when to reveal the truth. The ground staff radioed in, their voices nervous. "Passenger removed as requested." Standing by for further instructions. But before any further instructions could come, a senior airline manager hurried into the gate area. His eyes landed on the Thompsons, and his face went pale instantly. He knew exactly who they were. Whispers turned into gasps as the realization spread among some of the airport staff and a few informed passengers. The man they had just seen escorted off the plane wasn't just a wealthy businessman. He was the CEO, the very owner of the airline. Inside the cabin, the flight attendant was still trying to regain her composure, unaware of what had just been discovered outside. She poured a drink for a passenger, smiling tightly, though the murmurs around her wouldn't stop. That wasn't right. Someone whispered loudly enough for her to hear. She ignored it, focusing on the tray in her hands. But out in the terminal, the story had already shifted. The ejection, meant to embarrass the family, had flipped into something else entirely. The family wasn't powerless. They weren't outsiders. They were the very heart of the airline, the ones who made the flights possible, the ones who held the real authority and the truth was about to come crashing down on the flight attendant who thought she had been in control. For now, the Thompsons sat quietly in the waiting area, the children leaning against their mother, the father staring calmly at the departure board as though nothing unusual had happened. But behind that calm, there was a storm rising, one that would soon teach the crew, the passengers, and everyone watching a lesson they would never forget. The waiting area near the gate was unusually quiet. The Thompson family sat together, the children leaning against their mother while Mr. Thompson remained calm, his eyes steady on the large departure screen. To onlookers, they looked like an ordinary family, unfairly embarrassed. But to those who recognized him, whispers had already begun to spread. A tall man in a navy suit hurried through the terminal. His badge marked him as a senior airline manager, and the urgency in his steps made passengers turn their heads. He spotted the Thompsons immediately, his face draining of color. The sight of Mr. Thompson seated with his family made his heart drop because he knew exactly who he was looking at. "Sir," the manager stammered as he reached them, his breath uneven. I had no idea you were flying today." Double quotes. Mrs. Thompson looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Would it have mattered?" she asked, her tone calm but cutting. The manager swallowed hard, ignoring her question. He turned to Mr. Thompson, bowing his head slightly. "Mr. Thompson, I am deeply, deeply sorry. This should never have happened." Nearby passengers looked up, confused. A few leaned closer to each other, whispering, "Wait, did he say Mr. Thompson?" "The CEO." One woman gasped softly. "He owns the airline." The whispers spread quickly, louder now, fueled by shock. Eyes darted toward the family, realization dawning in waves across the terminal. The man who had been escorted off the plane wasn't just another passenger. He was the airline CEO, the man who signed paychecks, made executive decisions, and carried more power than anyone working in that airport. The children looked up at their father, confused by the sudden change in tone from the manager. "Daddy, why is he talking to you like that?" The older one asked quietly. Mr. Thompson smiled gently at his child, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Because now he remembers who I am." The manager's hands shook as he adjusted his tie. "Sir, please. Allow me to fix this immediately. I'll have the captain step off and apologize personally. I'll arrange another plane if needed. This is unacceptable." Passengers in the waiting area murmured louder now. Phones were lifted discreetly, cameras recording the unfolding scene. What had started as humiliation for the family was turning into humiliation for the airline itself. Back inside the plane, the flight attendant who had insisted the family be removed was pouring water for a passenger when the intercom crackled. Could the lead attendant please step outside the cabin for a moment? Her brows furrowed, confused but obedient. She set the tray down and stepped toward the door. When she entered the terminal and saw the scene, the manager bent nearly double in apology before the very family she had thrown. Off her stomach dropped her face, drained of color. The world around her blurred as her mind tried to process it. The man she had accused of not belonging. The man she had humiliated in front of a cabin full of passengers. Was the CEO, the very owner of the airline she worked for. She froze, her throat dry, her chest tightening with panic. The manager turned toward her sharply, his voice low but sharp. "Do you understand what you've done?" he hissed. Her lips trembled. She looked at Mr. Thompson, her eyes wide. "Sir, I didn't know. I thought." Her words broke, shame flooding her face. Mr. Thompson finally stood, his presence commanding even without raising his voice. He looked directly at her, his expression calm but powerful. "That's the problem. You didn't know, but you thought you did. You judged us before you had the facts. You assumed we didn't belong." The passengers who had followed the drama erupted in murmurs again. Some shaking their heads, others whispering. "He's right." The flight attendant's eyes filled with tears. She clasped her hands together, stammering, "Please, sir, I didn't mean," but Mr. Thompson raised a hand, silencing her. "This isn't about me. I'll be fine. But what about the next family you treat this way? What about the people who don't have the power to expose the truth? Respect isn't something you give only when you're afraid of who someone is. Respect should be given to everyone." The silence that followed was heavy. The words struck deep not just into the flight attendant, but into everyone within earshot. Passengers nodded quietly, recognizing the truth in his voice. Even the children, young as they were, seemed to understand the weight of what their father had just said. The manager stepped forward quickly, his face red with shame. "Sir, please accept our deepest apologies. We'll reboard you and your family immediately. And I assure you, this will be dealt with." Mr. Thompson gave a small nod, but didn't move right away. His eyes stayed locked on the attendant, whose hands now shook uncontrollably. She lowered her gaze, unable to meet his eyes. Finally, he turned to his family. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's go home." His voice carried no anger. It's a quiet authority. The passengers in the terminal watched silently as the Thompsons walked away, their dignity intact. The revelation had shifted everything. A moment of prejudice had turned into a public lesson, one that would be remembered not just by the airline, but by everyone who had witnessed it. The terminal was thick with tension. Passengers who had witnessed the ordeal leaned forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. Phones hovered discreetly in people's hands, recording every moment. The hum of the airport around them seemed to fade. This corner of the gate had become the center of gravity. Mr. Thompson stood tall, his presence commanding without effort. His wife and children sat quietly behind him, their faces tired but dignified. The airline manager hovered nervously at his side, sweat glistening at his temple. And in front of them, the flight attendant stood frozen, her hands twisting nervously. Her once practiced smile now shattered into shame. The silence broke when Mr. Thompson's voice filled the space, calm, low, but carrying weight that made every ear lean closer. "Do you know what you've done?" The flight attendant swallowed hard, her voice trembling. "Sir, I made a mistake. I didn't realize who you were." His eyes narrowed, his tone firm. "That's exactly the problem. You didn't care who we were. You looked at us and assumed we didn't belong. You judged my family by appearances, not facts." The words cut deep. Passengers nodded subtly, some murmuring agreement. A woman whispered, "He's right." I saw it all. The attendant's hands shook harder. I wasn't trying to discriminate. I was just following my instincts. Mr. Thompson stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. Instincts. Or prejudice. "Let me ask you this: if we had looked different, dressed differently, would you have asked for our tickets 3 times? Would you have forced us off a plane in front of hundreds of strangers?" Her lips parted, but no answer came. Her silence was louder than any denial could have been. He continued, his voice rising slightly now, though still controlled. "You embarrassed my wife. You frightened my children. You humiliated us in front of an entire cabin of passengers. And why? Because you decided we didn't belong in seats we had already paid for." Gasps rippled through the crowd again. The manager shifted uncomfortably, wishing he could disappear. Mrs. Thompson spoke softly from behind her husband, her voice steady but tinged with pain. "You didn't just take us off a plane. You taught my children a cruel lesson that no matter what we achieve, there will always be people who see us as less. Do you know what it's like to explain that to a child?" The attendant's eyes brimmed with tears. I didn't mean for it to happen like this." Mr. Thompson leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving hers. "Intentions don't erase consequences. Respect is not a privilege you hand out to people you approve of. It is the bare minimum you owe to every human being who walks onto that plane. Today, you failed that." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. For the first time since the ordeal began, the flight attendant lowered her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. She had no defense left. The manager stepped in quickly, desperate to regain control. "Mr. Thompson, please accept our apology. I promise this will be handled. The airline will take full responsibility." Mr. Thompson held up a hand, silencing him. His eyes still locked on the attendant. He said, "This isn't just about me. I have power. I can walk away from this knowing the truth will come out. But what about the next family? The next passenger who doesn't have that power? What will they face if nothing changes?" Passengers around the gate clapped softly at first, then louder. It wasn't applause for the humiliation. It was applause for the truth spoken out loud. The sound echoed through the terminal, making the attendant flinch and the manager flush with shame. Mr. Thompson finally straightened his shoulders, his voice softening slightly. "I don't want revenge. I want change. I want respect for every person who steps onto your planes. Because dignity should never depend on skin color, clothing, or assumptions. It should be the rule, not the exception." The applause grew stronger. Even staff members standing nearby nodded solemnly. Realizing the depth of what had just been said, the flight attendant wiped her tears, unable to meet his eyes. She whispered, "I'm sorry." Mr. Thompson gave a small nod, but his face remained firm. "Sorry is a start." But change is the real apology. With that, he turned back to his family, placing a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. His dignity was intact, his message delivered, and the truth undeniable. The confrontation was over. But the impact of his words lingered in the air like a storm that had passed yet left the ground forever changed. Asterisk. The terminal grew quiet again, after the applause faded. People sat in silence, still absorbing what they had just witnessed. For many, it felt like more than just an incident at the airport. It felt like a moment of truth. A mirror held up to everyone about respect, dignity, and the dangers of quick judgment. The Thompsons gathered their bags, preparing to leave. The children clung to their mother, still unsettled by the experience, but calmer now under their father's protective presence. Mrs. Thompson held her daughter close, whispering softly, "You are strong, my love. Don't let today make you feel small." Mr. Thompson remained steady, his expression calm, but his eyes carrying the weight of everything that had happened. He had spoken his truth, and he knew it had reached more than just the flight attendant, had reached every soul in that terminal. The manager, still pale, tried one more time. "Sir, please. Let us arrange a private flight for you. First-class treatment, immediate departure, anything you need. We don't want you to leave with this impression." Mr. Thompson turned to him, his tone even but sharp. "This isn't about luxury. It's not about comfort. It's about respect. If you want to make things right, start with your staff. Train them. Teach them to see people, not assumptions. If my family had been anyone else without this level of influence, today could have ended much worse." The words landed heavy. The manager nodded quickly, ashamed, promising, "Yes, sir. It will be done." The flight attendant stood quietly, her head lowered. Tears slipped down her face as she replayed the moment in her mind. The look in the children's eyes haunting her more than anything else. She realized that her mistake had not just been professional, it had been human. Passengers nearby whispered to each other, many vowing they would share the story. "The world needs to hear this," one man said. Another woman added, "People judge too quickly. This should be a lesson to all of us." Double quotes. Mr. Thompson guided his family toward the exit, walking with dignity. Every step, quiet but commanding. The children held his hands tightly, their small fingers gripping as if they knew their father had turned a painful moment into something greater. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the airport windows with streaks of orange and gold. The light fell across the family, wrapping them in a soft glow that felt symbolic, like hope after a storm. The lesson of the day was not about power or wealth. It was not about the humiliation of one flight attendant or the apology of an airline. It was about something bigger, something that every witness would carry long after they boarded their own flights. Respect is not optional. Dignity is not earned by appearance. And judgment, when made in haste, can leave scars deeper than any turbulence in the sky. For the passengers who had seen it unfold, the memory would remain etched in their minds. They would tell the story to friends, to family, to strangers about the day a flight attendant ejected a family, only to realize too late that they owned the airline. But the heart of the story was never about ownership. It was about how easily prejudice can blind us and how truth, once revealed, has the power to open every eye. As the Thompsons walked out of the terminal, Mr. Thompson glanced down at his children. "Do you see?" he asked gently. "Respect is not something you wait for, it's something you demand by knowing your worth. Never let anyone make you feel like you don't belong." The children nodded, their young faces reflecting both pain and pride. They had learned a lesson that day, to not from the cruelty of judgment, but from the strength of their parents' dignity. The story of that flight would spread far beyond the walls of the airport. It would travel across social media, news outlets, and conversations around dinner tables. But for the Thompson family, The only story that mattered was the one they carried in their hearts, the reminder that truth always rises. And that respect, once demanded, can never be denied. And for the flight attendant, the lesson was carved even deeper. Her mistake was public, unforgettable, but perhaps necessary. Because sometimes it takes one powerful moment to break old habits, to strip away blinders, and to remind us all that humanity begins with humility. The day that began as an ordinary flight ended as a lesson for an entire world. Never judge who someone is by how they look. Because the person you underestimate may just be the one who owns the skies you work in.